Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the muddy boots, clunky armor, and endlessly romanticized life of a medieval knight, but I promise you, this is not going to feel like the bedtime fairy tale you grew up with. Imagine yourself standing in a drafty stone hall, your shiny armor glinting in torchlight. Sounds epic, right? But then you realize the armor is pinching, your underclothes are full of lice, and tomorrow you'll be ordered to trudge knee-deep in mud on an empty stomach. You probably won't survive this, but hey, that's the charm of bedtime history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You imagine being knighted as the culmination of every childhood dream. Banners snapping in the breeze, golden spurs gleaming, maidens smiling as you lift your visor. The ceremony is packed with symbolism. You kneel. A sword taps your shoulders and suddenly you're Sir. But within hours, you realize the fantasy and the job description are worlds apart. The reality of daily night life is harsher than any battlefield. Your mornings begin not with applause, but with the stench of stale rushes on the floor, chamber pots emptied to close to the kitchen, and the groaning sound of a squire fumbling with buckles as he straps you in. And while every modern movie paints knights as independent heroes, you actually live at the mercy of your lord, bound to follow orders that range from defending his lands to chasing down tax-dodging peasants. Historically, the knightly class did emerge as a kind of military elite, professional warriors sworn to serve nobles in exchange for land or privilege. But historians still argue whether knights were truly defenders of justice or just heavily armed rent collectors. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You might think of yourself as a living fortress, but most villagers saw you as another burden. The quirky twist here: in some ceremonies, a newly dubbed knight was literally smacked on the neck or cheek as symbolic coup, to remind him that his body now belonged to the battlefield. Imagine trying to feel dignified while your noble lord casually slaps you in front of everyone. Not exactly the Hollywood moment. And beyond the pageantry, regret sets in quickly. Your armor isn't magical, it chafes. Your sword isn't Excalibur, it rusts. Your lord doesn't treat you like a legend, he treats you like a glorified errand boy with expensive equipment. You begin to sense that the only people truly enjoying knighthood are the troubadours writing ballads about it, while you drag yourself into yet another muddy skirmish you'll forget by next winter. This is the gap we're exploring tonight. The dream of being a knight versus the unforgiving, sweaty, sore, and very human reality. And once you see behind the curtain, you'll understand why you'd regret every clanking step. Your knightly story really begins long before that shiny sword ever rests on your shoulder. From the moment you're 7 years old, your parents have already shipped you off to a noble household to begin training. Childhood as you imagine it, tree climbing, chasing chickens, inventing silly games, vanishes overnight. Instead, your days are packed with endless drills, going to superiors and learning how to serve. You're a page now, which is a fancy medieval way of saying the noble family's errand kid. You run messages, you clean boots, you fetch wine, you get blamed when the hounds chew through the rush mats, and in between chores, you train, holding wooden swords until your arms feel like they're made of boiled turnips, or riding ponies that seem personally invested in throwing you into the nearest puddle. The romantic idea of a childhood spent in a castle. Reality check: castles are cold, drafty, and often stink of smoke, mildew, and people who think bathing twice a year is showing off. By 14, you've graduated to being a squire. Congratulations, you're now the personal assistant to a full knight. This means strapping on his armor, polishing every rusty hinge, tending to his horse, and trying not to cry when he whacks you with the flat of his blade for being too slow. Real swordplay training begins now, and so do the bruises. You learn to swing a heavy blade until your shoulders throb, to tilt a lance at a target until you taste dust, and to tumble in full mail until you wonder if you'll ever walk straight. Again, the historical fact here It often took over a decade of relentless apprenticeship before a boy could even hope to be knighted, and even then, many didn't make the cut. Some squires ended up permanently stuck in that role. Their knighthood never granted because their families lacked the money or connections. But here's the quirky tidbit: training wasn't just about weapons. You were also expected to master dancing, poetry, and playing the lute. Yes, you, the sweaty teenager with blisters, strumming awkwardly while your knightly master mutters that you sound like a dying goose. Imagine collapsing after sword drills only to be told, "Now, sing a ballad about courtly love." Historians still argue whether this training was genuinely meant to build well-rounded gentlemen, or just a way for nobles to keep their pages too busy to get into trouble. Either way, your childhood is essentially an unpaid internship with lots of pain and very little appreciation. And that nagging sense of regret? It's already whispering to you, you wanted gallantry, but you've gotten grazed knees, blisters, bruised pride, and the faint suspicion that you're just a future casualty in shiny metal waiting to happen. Now, you're officially knighted. Congratulations or condolences, because the first time you put on your full suit of armor, you realize it's less like being a superhero and more like strapping yourself into a portable oven. Chainmail alone weighs around 20 to 30 kilograms, and plate armor, when you can afford it, pushes that number closer to 40. Imagine walking around with your younger sibling clinging to your back all day. That's you, except your sibling is made of steel and smells faintly of rust. When you try to mount your horse, you wobble like a drunk toddler. One misplaced step in muddy ground, and your foot sinks so deep you need the squires to haul you upright again. It's heroic in paintings, but in real life you look like a turtle on its back. The irony? Armor really could protect you at least against sword cuts and glancing blows, but against gravity, hunger, or a misstep in the wrong stream, you're doomed. More than one knight drowned after slipping into water, too heavy to drag himself out. Historians still argue whether those stories were exaggerated, but you'd probably prefer not to test the theory yourself. Inside the helmet, your world shrinks. You see only a thin slit of light. You hear the muffled clang of your own breath bouncing back, mixed with the rhythmic squeak of metal joints. If you're lucky, there's a padded arming cap to cushion your skull. If you're unlucky, the helmet smacks against your nose every time you turn your head. And don't forget the smell: sweat-soaked linen, grease rubbed into the metal, and the sour tang of leather straps left to dry in damp corners. Romance novelists conveniently left that part out. And then there's the heat. Marching under the summer sun, you start to feel like a roast chicken left in the oven too long. Some knights fainted, collapsing in a heap while enemies laughed and poked them with sticks. It's little comfort to know that the greatest warriors of Europe also had the same problem. Your misery is historical solidarity at best. But here's the quirky tidbit: not all armor was practical. Some knights actually had their suits gilded or etched with patterns. More fashion statement than battlefield tool. Imagine dying in combat because you chose the medieval equivalent of designer jeans. You wanted to feel invincible. But what you feel instead is clumsy, overheated, and vaguely ridiculous. The dream of shining armor? It's quickly reduced to the reality of sore shoulders, a parched throat, and the nagging regret that you can't even scratch your own nose without help. If you thought armor was heavy, wait until you feel the weight of the bills. Knighthood doesn't just cost you blood and sweat, it costs a mountain of silver. To become a knight, your family has already drained its coffers paying for training, equipment, and horses. By the time you're finally dubbed sir, your parents are quietly wondering if they should have invested in sheep instead. The hard fact is this: a single warhorse could cost the equivalent of a small farm. Add the armor, which needs constant maintenance, plus swords, shields, lances, and daggers, and you're basically carrying a fortune on your back, and none of it lasts forever. Metal dents, wood splinters, and horses, well, let's just say they don't come with lifetime warranties. Knighthood is supposed to elevate you socially, but the reality is that you're always broke. You're expected to throw feasts when you're knighted, buy gifts for your lord, and keep up appearances, fail to do so, and whispers start: so and so can't even afford wine for his guests. Your reputation is as fragile as the brittle edge of your sword after the third parry. The quirky tidbit? Some knights pawn their own armor just to pay tournament entry fees or gambling debts. Imagine standing at the armorer's door, sheepishly, asking if he'll buy back the helmet you were boasting about last week. Historians still argue whether knighthood was truly an economic privilege, or a crushing financial trap. Certainly, the wealthiest knights could manage, but for the middling ones like you, every joust, every campaign, every fancy feast threatens to send you spiraling into debt. You're less a hero and more a walking, armored investment risk. And the worst part, even when you win battles, you don't get to keep the spoils. The lion's share goes to your lord. You might get a crust of bread, maybe a rusty dagger. While he pockets the ransom money for captured enemies, your sword is his sword, your horse is his horse, and your paycheck is, well, mostly imaginary. You wanted prestige. What you get is a lifestyle where you constantly regret every clinking coin that disappears into another repair bill, another bribe, or another feast for people who barely remember your name the next morning. By now, you've realized that even your horse outranks you in comfort. Knights might strut around bragging about courage and honor, but behind the bravado is one simple truth. Your warhorse is the star of the show, and you're just the sweaty sidekick holding the reins. A proper destrier, those massive, muscular chargers bred for battle costs more than most peasants will ever see in their lifetimes. And once you own one, you treat it better than you treat yourself. The animal gets oats, clean stables, regular grooming, and a blanket when the wind turns. Cold. You're gnawing on hard bread and sleeping on a damp straw mattress, praying the fleas take the night off. The historical fact here: knights trained not just with swords, but in horsemanship for years, because without a well-disciplined steed, you were practically useless on the battlefield. Horses were so valuable that ransom agreements sometimes specified them separately. Your enemy might let you go, but only if you left the horse behind. Here's a quirky tidbit: war horses were often trained to bite and kick in combat. Imagine your proud destrier lunging at an enemy soldier, with teeth bared like some medieval pit bull. You may swing the sword, but your horse is the real weapon. Historians still argue whether knights were truly inseparable from their horses, or whether that's a romantic exaggeration. But the fact remains, if your destrier goes lame, you're suddenly reduced to trudging in heavy armor like a glorified infantryman. And good luck looking impressive on a shaggy farm pony. Nothing kills the aura of knightly terror faster than clanking toward your enemy on what looks like a children's petting zoo. Reject dots so you regretfully notice that your animal has a groom, a diet plan, and probably better medical care than you. Meanwhile, you sprain your back trying to hoist yourself into the saddle, sweat under layers of steel, and wonder if you'll ever be half as respected as the creature carrying you. It dawns on you, in the hierarchy of medieval glory, you're not the shining knight on horseback, you're the accessory to the horse. Every time you think you might finally control your destiny, you're reminded that knighthood is really just a lifetime of serving someone richer. You don't ride into battle because you want to, you ride because your lord commands it. You don't decide when to eat or when to rest. Your schedule is dictated by the whims of a noble who sees you less as a human and more as an armored asset. Your food, your lodgings, your very armor depend on his generosity. If he's pleased, you might get an extra portion of roasted pork at dinner. If he's displeased, you're polishing his boots until your fingers blister. Historically, knights were bound by oaths of fealty, which meant you promised loyalty and service to a specific lord in exchange for land or protection. Sounds noble on paper, but in practice, it feels like permanent unpaid overtime. Here's the quirky tidbit: sometimes lords made their knights perform humiliating tests of loyalty, like standing guard outside their chambers all night or serving as entertainment during feasts. Imagine strutting in your expensive armor 1 minute and being ordered to juggle fruit for drunk nobles the next. Historians still argue whether this system truly ensured loyalty or simply bred resentment. What's clear is that you're rarely your own master. You may dream of independence, but you're constantly tethered to another man's fortune and feuds. and a shadow of your lord looms everywhere. You want to marry. Ask permission. You want to claim spoils from battle. He takes the lion's share. You want to leave his service. Good luck. Breaking an oath could mark you as dishonorable, and dishonor follows you like the smell of horse dung clinging to your boots. Regret creeps in fast. You thought becoming a knight meant freedom and power, but all you've won is a heavier chain. The peasants fear you, the troubadours sing of you, but at the end of the day, you're still just someone's armored employee, living always in the Lord's shadow. So, you've strapped on your armor, mounted your prized horse, and lined up with your fellow knights. This is it, the battle moment you dreamed of as a kid. Trumpets blare, banners wave, and adrenaline surges through you. For a heartbeat, you believe the songs are true, that you'll ride down enemies in a blaze of gallantry. But within minutes, the fantasy collapses. War in the Middle Ages isn't heroic. It's mud sucking at your boots, arrows whizzing out of nowhere, and the constant dread that the man next to you is about to be skewered. You charge forward, lance lowered, but visibility through your helmet slit is so poor you barely see the ground rushing under your horse's hooves. Then comes the chaos, screams, clanging steel, and men groaning as they trip over corpses or fall into ditches dug by peasants, who were much cleverer than you gave them credit for. The hard historical fact: most medieval battles were less about glorious duels and more about endurance. Exhaustion and disease killed far more knights than swords did. Campaigns dragged on for weeks, often with little food and less water, until armies simply collapsed from hunger. Here's the quirky tidbit: knights sometimes carried small hammers or daggers specifically to bash through helmet visors or pry open armor joints. So much for elegant swordplay. Battle could come down to you awkwardly poking another armored man in the armpit while praying he doesn't stab you first. Historians still argue whether medieval warfare was truly as chaotic as chroniclers described, or whether some order did exist among the madness. But you, in the thick of it, only know panic. The ground shakes, your horse neighs in terror, and you realize there's nothing glamorous about surviving on stale bread, while trying not to die of dysentery before the next skirmish. Regret gnaws at you. You wanted a stage for heroism, but what you've got is a filthy, terrifying slog where survival itself feels like an unlikely luxury. If open battle is misery, then a siege is pure torment. You march with your lord's army to some stone fortress, expecting action and glory, only to discover that siege really means camping in mud for months while staring at walls. Days stretch into weeks as you and your fellow knights dig trenches, haul rocks, and swat flies. Heroic? Not in the slightest. The historical fact: sieges were actually the dominant form of medieval warfare. Castles were tough, nuts to crack, so most. Conflicts devolved into long standoffs. You wait, hungry and filthy, while engineers build catapults and towers. Arrows rain down from defenders who have the luxury of fresh water and baked bread inside their walls. You're chewing hardtack that could chip a tooth and drinking river water that tastes suspiciously like manure. Here's a quirky tidbit: some besiegers catapulted diseased animal carcasses, or even human heads over the walls to spread panic or, in theory, plague. Imagine the smell wafting across the camp, mingling with your already foul tunic. So much for the chivalry code. Medieval warfare was basically weaponized stink, and historians still argue whether disease or starvation killed more soldiers than enemy swords during sieges. Contemporary accounts paint grim pictures of men reduced to eating horses, dogs, and, in the darkest times, leather from old saddles just to stay alive. You signed up for knighthood, but you didn't realize you'd be gnawing on boiled shoe straps for dinner. The worst part: even victory is anticlimactic. After months of suffering, the castle finally falls and your lord claims the treasure. You get maybe a rusty goblet and another scar to add to your collection. Meanwhile, the peasants inside curse you as the invader who burned their crops and spoiled their well. Regret weighs heavier than your armor. You dreamed of shining in combat, but instead you sit in a damp trench swarmed by lice, coughing from smoke and realizing that glory looks a lot like dysentery. After months of grim sieges and muddy marches, you might think tournaments offer a welcome break finally. A chance to show off in front of a cheering crowd instead of starving in a ditch. But don't be fooled. These so-called games are just another way to break bones, drain your purse, and pile on regrets. The historical fact: early tournaments weren't polite jousts with neatly painted lists and fluttering ribbons. They were massive melees, basically mock battles where dozens, even hundreds of knights charged at each other across open fields. The idea was practice, but the reality was broken lances, crushed ribs, and the occasional knight trampled into the mud while spectators shouted for more. You picture yourself galloping into the lists, lance gleaming, maidens sighing. What actually happens? Your lance shatters on someone's shield, splinters jab your cheek, and you're tossed onto the ground, wind knocked out of you. Then, while you're still gasping like a fish, some opportunistic knight grabs your horse as a prize. Congratulations, you just lost your most valuable possession in the name of sport. Here's the quirky tidbit. Tournaments were so dangerous that the church tried to ban them multiple times, calling them sinful distractions. Of course, lords ignored the bans, because tournaments were too good for business betting. Bragging rights and ransoms brought in piles of money. Imagine God himself wagging a finger at your pastime, and you still showing up because you can't afford to miss a chance at reputation. Historians still argue whether tournaments were genuine training for war or glorified entertainment for board nobles. Either way, they left you battered and broke. Armor repairs cost a fortune, and losing a joust could mean losing your gear entirely. Some knights even mortgaged their estates just to enter, only to limp home empty-handed. The regret hits hard. You wanted a stage for honor, but tournaments are just another trap, expensive, humiliating, and designed to remind you that you're one unlucky tilt away from disaster. You thought your weapons would be extensions of your strength, steel singing through the air, flashing in sunlight. Instead, they betray you at the worst moments. Your sword, that symbol of knightly valor, is heavy, expensive, and not nearly as dependable as the ballads suggest. After a few clashes, its edge dulls, its tip bends, and suddenly you're hacking at armor like you're chopping firewood with a spoon. The lance, one strike and it usually splinters into a useless stick. Impressive when it shatters against a shield. Less impressive when it misses entirely and you're left galloping forward, with nothing but air in your hands. Daggers, the so-called knight's last resort, often end up buried in mud before they reach an enemy's throat, and axes, yes, they look brutal, but try swinging one after 10 minutes in full armor. Your arms feel like wet noodles. The historical fact here: most knights carried multiple weapons because no single one was reliable. The sword was often a backup, not the main killer. In reality, polearms, maces, and good old brute force often won the day. The legendary image of dueling with perfect swordplay is mostly a later invention. Quirky tidbit: some knights named their swords, giving them grand titles like Excalibur or Cold Killer. Yours feels more like bent edge or slippery handle. There's not much dignity in yelling, "Fear me, for I wield rusty McCrust face." Historians still argue whether swords were truly practical weapons of war or primarily status symbols for show. Archaeologists keep finding ceremonial blades in graves that were never sharpened, suggesting some knights looked dangerous but were basically posing with shiny props. Regret creeps in each time your weapons fail you. You wanted tools of glory, but what you've got are unreliable hunks of metal, liable to slip from your grip, shatter on impact, or get stuck in a shield while you stand there wondering why you didn't just become a farmer instead. The armor clanks, the weapons splinter. The horse eats better than you, but none of it compares to the sheer stench that clings to you day after day. Forget the perfume-soaked image of knights in shining armor. The truth is, you reek. And so does everyone else. Bathing in the Middle Ages isn't a daily ritual, it's practically a seasonal event. Public bathhouses exist in some towns, but they're often condemned by the church as sinful hangouts. So, you end up rinsing off maybe a few times a year. The rest of the time, you're stuck in sweat-soaked linen, horsehair padding, and metal that traps heat and grime like a slow-cooking stew. The hard fact: armor padding, called a gambeson, absorbed sweat like a sponge. After a campaign, it could weigh several pounds more than when you put it on soaked through with days of marching. No amount of scented herbs tucked into your sleeves can mask that aroma. Here's the quirky tidbit: some knights tried bizarre remedies to cope with the sun and stink. Records mention medieval soldiers using pastes made from ground herbs, pig fat, and, believe it or not, crocodile dung as a sort of sunscreen. Imagine smearing yourself with that before climbing into 40 kilos of steel. Suddenly the heat stroke doesn't sound so bad. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene was as horrendous as popular legend makes it. Some point to accounts of perfumed oils, tooth powders, and fancy combs among the elite. But for you, living in trenches and drafty holes, the lived reality is more fermented laundry than rose garden. And the worst part, everyone notices. Your squire wrinkles his nose while buckling you in. Your lord pretends not to gag during banquets. Even your warhorse twitches his ears as if to say, "Really, you again?" The regret piles up. You imagined knights as noble, gleaming figures admired from afar. What you've become is a walking, clanking odor, trailing horse sweat, spoiled meat, and unwashed socks into every hole you enter. As if the mud, stink, and splintered weapons weren't enough, the church hovers over every move you make, wagging its collective finger. Being a knight doesn't mean living free. It means being constantly reminded that God is watching, priests are judging, and your soul is one bad decision away from eternal barbecue. The historical fact: knights were bound by religious oaths. You swore to protect the church, defend widows and orphans, and uphold Christian values. In theory, this sounded noble. In practice, it meant clerics had the authority to scold you for pillaging, fine you for missing mass, and demand donations. Every time your conscience felt heavy, which, in your line of work, was basically every week. Here's the quirky tidbit: some knights wore little relics sewn into their clothes, bones of saints, scraps of holy cloth, even vials of blessed dust to give them divine protection. Picture yourself clanking into battle with a toenail of saint somebody bouncing against your chest, convinced it'll deflect arrows. Spoiler, it won't. Historians still argue whether the church truly curbed knightly violence or simply profited from it. The peace of God and truce of God movements tried to limit when and where knights could fight, but enforcing them was like telling hungry wolves to avoid sheep on weekends. Yet, the church made sure to keep you paying penance. Knights were expected to atone for sins with donati, alms, pilgrimages, or sometimes entire crusades, and make no mistake, priests never let you forget your failings. One sermon paints you as a holy warrior, the next condemns you as a greedy brute. You're trapped between bloodshed and guilt, fighting for survival while being told you're a sinner for doing exactly what you swore to do. Your regret grows sharper. You thought knighthood gave you honor, but instead it chains you to constant surveillance, nagging, and guilt. You're not a free warrior, you're a soldier under contract with both your lord and the church, both eager to claim pieces of your soul and your coin purse. And now we come to the biggest myth of all: chivalry. You've been told it's the code that makes you noble, a shining set of rules about protecting the weak, respecting women, and fighting honorably. But once you actually ride out, you realize chivalry is less a law and more a bedtime story for troubadours to sing about in taverns. The hard historical fact: knights were often tasked with enforcing their lord's will, which usually meant collecting taxes, raiding villages, or suppressing uprisings. Instead of rescuing maidens, you're trampling peasants' crops to remind them who's boss. Chivalry doesn't put bread on your lord's table, plunder does. Here's the quirky tidbit: some knights wore their ladies' undergarments or even locks of hair tied to their helmets as tokens of love. It looked romantic in poems, but in real life, it probably smelled weird after a week of rain and sweat. Imagine your enemy pausing mid-duel just to laugh at the lacy rag flapping from your visor. Historians still argue whether chivalry was ever truly practiced or simply preached. Documents show knights swearing oaths to uphold it, but chronicles are full of them looting monasteries, burning villages, and brawling in taverns. The contradiction is glaring. You're supposed to be noble, but the system keeps ordering you to act like a thug in shiny metal dot, and so the regret digs in deeper. You dreamed of gallantry, of stories sung about your deeds, but no bard is going to compose a ballad called Asterisk, the knight who confiscated sheep. Asterisk instead. You spend your days doing the dirty work of the powerful, dressed up in the costume of virtue while your actual tasks reek of hypocrisy. You wanted to live the legend, but all you've become is proof that legends and reality rarely match. If chivalry's promises already feel hollow, wait until you realize that even your life isn't your own. You picture courtly romance nights serenading maidens, secret glances across candlelit halls. In reality, marriage is a business deal, and you're just the signature at the bottom of a parchment. The historical fact: most knightly marriages were arranged for land, alliances, or wealth. Your lord might decide who you marry, or your family brokers a deal to secure more acres. Love is optional, dowries are not. If you're lucky, your bride is someone you at least recognize. If you're unlucky, she's a complete stranger who arrives with a chest of linens and a cold glare that says she didn't sign up for this either. The quirky tidbit: courtly love, the flowery tradition of knights pining for unattainable ladies, was often just a literary game. You might compose verses about your lord's wife, swearing eternal devotion, but everyone knows you're not meant to act on it. It's like medieval flirting fan fiction, great for entertainment, terrible for actual relationships. Imagine spending hours penning a ballad only to have it passed down the court as a joke about your bad rhyming. Historians still argue whether knights truly lived these double lives, dutiful husbands in arranged marriages but playful lovers in the poetic sense, or whether the whole concept of courtly love was simply a fantasy cooked up by poets to keep nobles entertained. Either way, you're caught in the middle, chained to obligations, teased with illusions of romance, and never quite in control. Regret swells in your chest. You wanted a storybook romance, but instead you're traded like property. You lift your visor hoping for affection, but find only contracts, alliances, and cold dinners in drafty halls. Your heart is yours, but your marriage is your lord's decision. And nothing makes knighthood feel lonelier than realizing even love isn't your choice. You think a knight's table will be groaning under the weight of roast swans, golden goblets, and fine wine. Instead, you sit down to food so bland and questionable it makes hardtack from the siege camp feel luxurious. The historical fact: most knights, unless spectacularly wealthy, ate a monotonous diet. Stale rye bread, pottage, a kind of gloopy vegetable stew, and salted pork were daily staples. Fresh meat and spices were reserved for feasts, which happened only when your lord wanted to show off. The rest of the time, you gnaw through bread, so tough you could patch a roof with it. Here's the quirky tidbit: medieval cooks often tried to disguise spoiled meat with heavy spices or vinegar. So when you're chewing the tangy mutton, it's not a delicacy, it's a cover-up. No wonder you feel queasy halfway through. And don't even get me started on ale. It's weak, warm, and often safer than water, but it tastes like someone strained it through a haystack. Historians still argue whether medieval cuisine was genuinely dreadful or simply unfamiliar to our modern taste buds. Some evidence shows elaborate recipes with exotic spices, but those were for the elites at high feasts. For you, most meals blur into grey stews that smell faintly of cabbage and regret. And food safety, forget it. Flies buzz around the kitchen. Salt barely masks the rot. And your servants drop half the loaf into the rushes before dusting it off and serving it back to you. You're a knight, armored and powerful. Yet you spend half your evenings hoping tonight's dinner won't leave you sprinting for the garderobe at dawn. So much for banquets in shining halls. You wanted decadent meals. What you get is chewy bread, questionable pork, and the nagging suspicion that your stomach may be your deadliest enemy yet. If you've convinced yourself that at least the common folk admire you, that your gleaming armor inspires, or brace yourself, because when you clank past the fields, the peasants don't whisper prayers of thanks, they mutter curses under their breath and roll their eyes once you're out of earshot. The historical fact: knights weren't universally loved protectors. To peasants, You were often just another tax collector, raider, or enforcer of your lord's whims. You trampled their crops, seized their grain for the war effort, and demanded service whenever your army passed through. They might bow in public, but behind closed doors, you were the monster they told their children about. Here's the quirky tidbit. Folklore is littered with jokes and sneaky songs mocking knights. Some villages composed satirical ballads about bumbling armored, men falling off horses or getting stuck in ditches. Imagine being the subject of a medieval roast while everyone pretends to respect you at market. Historians still argue whether knights genuinely offered protection to their local peasants, or simply exploited them. Some accounts praise noble defenders, who shielded villagers from bandits, while others describe brutal extortion, where knights became indistinguishable from the threats they were supposed to fight. The truth probably depended on who your master was and whether he preferred generosity or greed. For you, though, the admiration is a lie. You wave gallantly from horseback, but the peasants glare at your shadow. You ride into their village, thinking you're a hero, but you leave with their hay, their chickens, and their patience. The songs of the troubadours may make you a legend, but the whispers of the fields brand you something far less flattering. The regret sharpens. You imagined adoring eyes and grateful hearts. What you get instead is thinly veiled resentment, curses, spat into the dirt, and the sinking realization that you're less a guardian and more an oppressor in their story. When battle wounds and daily aches finally catch up with you, you might think a medieval doctor can patch you up, but brace yourself because medicine in this age often makes things worse. The historical fact, treatment for injuries was primitive at best. A slash on your arm, out come the leeches to balance your humours. A nasty cough, you're handed a syrup of honey, vinegar, and ground up herbs that taste like boiled long clippings. A broken bone, expect hot irons to cauterize, or splints so crude you'll heal crooked for life. The quirky tidbit, some remedies sound like they were invented on a dare. For instance, powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies was sometimes prescribed as medicine in later centuries, believed to carry mystical healing powers. In your time, though, you might be smeared with ointments made from butter, onion, and urine. Imagine lying there, groaning, while someone proudly rubs barnyard soup on your wound. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was completely ineffective, or whether certain herbal treatments did offer relief. Records suggest that willow bark, for example, was used for pain, essentially an early form of aspirin. But for every helpful poultice, there were 5 bizarre rituals involving chanting, astrology, or wearing amulets filled with dried frog bits and surgery. That's a nightmare. An arrow lodged in your shoulder means a barber surgeon with shaky hands digs it out using forceps. Rinsed in wine, no anesthesia. You bite down on a strap, hoping you'll pass out before the real pain begins. If infection sets in, and it often does, your career might end in a feverish blur. Regret gnaws deeper. You imagine noble scars, proof of bravery. Watch you endure botched cures, searing pain, and treatments so questionable you begin to suspect the disease might actually be the kinder option, even if you manage to limp away from the surgeons. Chair with all your limbs still attached. Daily life outside the battlefield isn't safe either. Traveling from one town to another feels less like a ride through your domain, and more like tempting fate. The historical fact, roads in the Middle Ages were dangerous. Bandits lurked in forests, outlaws set traps, and enemy knights were eager to snatch you for ransom. That ransom wasn't a rare occurrence, it was practically a business model. Capture a knight, lock him up, and wait for his family or lord to pay a small fortune to get him back. Quirky tidbit, some knights carried coded badges or secret phrases to identify themselves in hostile lands, kind of like medieval passwords. But if you lost your token or mumbled the wrong line, you might find yourself shackled instead of welcomed. Imagine showing up at a castle gate, stammering through the wrong phrase, and getting tossed into the dungeon for your trouble. Historians still argue whether medieval roads were truly overrun with bandits, or whether chroniclers exaggerated to justify tolls and patrols. Either way, the fear was real. You never travel unarmed, never without companions. and never without that pit in your stomach reminding you this could be the ride, where your luck runs out, and then there are your rivals' other knights bristling for jewels. Sometimes honor is just a thin excuse to start a fight. You think you're on your way to a friendly banquet, only to be challenged by some armored hothead who claims you insulted his banner colors. Win, and you're bruised and bleeding again. Lose, and you're disgraced, or worse, dead in a ditch. Regret presses tighter. You thought knighthood meant safety, prestige, and freedom to roam instead. Every journey feels like walking into a trap, every rival like a storm cloud, and every shadowy tree like the perfect place for an ambush. Even when you're not dodging arrows or bandits, money still weighs like a millstone around your neck. Knighthood doesn't just cost a fortune. To maintain it also entangles you in the endless misery of taxes. And unlike the peasants who only pay once, you're caught in the middle, crushed from both sides. The historical fact: knights often acted as tax collectors for their lords. You ride into villages demanding grain, livestock, or coin, and peasants hand it over with clenched jaws. Then, when you return triumphant with your sacks of silver, your lord promptly skims off the lion's share, leaving you barely enough to cover the repair of your dented helmet. The quirky tidbit: some lords demanded taxes in strange forms like honey, falcons, or even snow from the mountains to chill their summer drinks. Imagine explaining to starving farmers that, yes, they must climb into icy peaks just so his lordship can sip wine a little cooler in July. You're the one enforcing it, which means you get the peasants' curses stuck to your armor like mud. Historians still argue whether knights were true beneficiaries of the feudal system, or simply pawns caught in its gears. Sure, technically you held land in exchange for service, but much of that land was heavily taxed, mortgaged, or barely fertile. For every knight living comfortably off estates, dozens were drowning in debt, and the humiliation is constant. You strut in armor that costs more than a village harvest, yet you scramble to pay the next levy. One year you're forced to sell off family heirlooms. The next, you're borrowing from moneylenders at ruinous rates. You're not a hero, you're a medieval accountant desperately trying to balance the books. Regret presses hardest here. You dreamed of wealth and power, but knighthood has turned you into both tax collector and taxpayer, loathed by the peasants, squeezed by your lord, and broke despite all the glitter of your steel. You might think your armor and weapons make you invincible, but the world around you is already inventing ways to make you obsolete. Technology, in its slow medieval way, is creeping up, and every new invention laughs at your steel-plated swagger. The historical fact: the longbow changed everything. English archers at battles like Crecy and Agincourt turned heavily armored knights into walking targets. A single peasant with a yew-bow could punch arrows straight through your visor slit. All your years of training, all your gilded armor undone by a farmer's son with strong arms and good aim. Here's the quirky tidbit: early firearms arrived on the scene. 2 clunky hand cannons that roared smoke and sparks. They were wildly inaccurate, but the noise alone spooked horses and rattled even the bravest knights. Imagine you, proud on your destrier, suddenly ducking like a startled pigeon because some gunner's pipe just belched fire at you. Historians still argue whether these technologies truly ended knighthood or merely changed its form. Some say the knightly class faded quickly in the face of gunpowder. Others claim social prestige kept them relevant for centuries longer. But on the battlefield, you feel the truth in your bones. The age of the armored warrior is wobbling, and you can't ignore how vulnerable you feel. You once charged boldly into melees, but now you hesitate. That peasant archer in the hedgerow, he might end your career before you even raise your lance. The thunder of gunpowder in the distance, that's the sound of your roll cracking apart. Regret swells sharper. You didn't just sign up for a hard life, you signed up for one destined to be outdated. While you sweat inside metal casing, the world is already moving on, inventing weapons that mock your every struggle. If you thought the dangers came only from peasants with bows or strange new weapons, think again. Sometimes the sharpest threat comes from the very men who call you brother. Life among knights is supposed to be a brotherhood, bound by honor, oaths, and shared battles. In practice, It's a simmering stew of rivalries, jealousy, and backstabbing, sometimes literally. The historical fact: knights frequently feuded with one another, even within the same lord's service. Disputes over land, spoils, or even whose banner should fly higher at a feast could erupt into violence. Feuds sometimes stretched across generations, making it hard to tell whether you're riding into a battle for your lord, or a private grudge match your ancestors started a century ago. Here's the quirky tidbit: in some tournaments, knights actually bribed squires to tamper with their rivals' equipment, loosening straps, dulling blades, or slipping mud on a saddle. Imagine suiting up, only to discover halfway through the joust that your own brother-in-arms arranged your humiliation. Historians still argue whether the bonds of knighthood were genuine camaraderie or just thin veneers masking constant competition. Chroniclers praise the fellowship of crusading knights, yet documents are filled with lawsuits, betrayals, and duels. The evidence paints a messy picture, one where loyalty often ends the moment gold is on the table, and you feel it keenly. The knight who trains beside you by day may be whispering against you by night. That feast where you raise a goblet in cheer could be the same hall where someone slips poison into your wine. Trust becomes a luxury and suspicion your constant companion. The regret bites deep. You dreamed of a noble brotherhood, but the reality is more like a wolf pack, each armored predator ready to tear the other apart for scraps of honor, wealth, or survival. By now, you've survived battles, sieges, disease, betrayals, and even the church's scolding sermons. But time itself becomes the enemy you can't defeat. Old age comes early for a knight, and by 40 an age modern folks consider middle-aged, you're already limping, coughing, and counting your regrets like rosary beads. The historical fact: the average lifespan for a medieval knight wasn't long, especially if he spent decades campaigning. Arthritis gnawed at joints battered by years in armor. Old wounds festered, never truly healing. Teeth rotted from constant bread and salted meat, and stomachs churned after years of questionable medicine. Many knights spent their final years not at banquets but propped on benches wrapped in blankets, and reminiscing about battles they barely survived. Here's the quirky tidbit: some retired knights commissioned elaborate tomb effigies, showing them in perfect youthful armor even if in reality they hobbled to the sculptor's workshop on crutches. Imagine gasping for breath, joints stiff as frozen hinges, while approving a statue of yourself as a chiseled warrior. Medieval Photoshop at its finest. Historians still argue whether knights truly embraced retirement or whether many clung to relevance. Until death, some joined monastic orders, trading lances for prayer beads. Others became castellans or advisors, their fighting days behind them. But the legend of eternal vigor was just that, a legend. Reality was more like groaning awake with a stiff back, and praying today's weather didn't make your joints ache worse. You thought knighthood made you immortal in story and song. Instead, you faced the sobering truth: your body ages faster than your reputation. You're still expected to stand tall at feasts, but your knees tremble when you rise. You dream of gallantry, but most mornings you just dream of a softer mattress. The regret becomes bone deep. You gave your youth to knighthood, and in return it gave you scars, debts, and a fast-forward button on old age. You shuffle through your final years, stiff in the joints, haunted by memories of broken lances and bitter marches, and yet the world remembers you differently. Troubadours still sing of knights as if they were shining heroes on endless quests, rescuing maidens and slaying dragons. The irony is almost cruel. You lived the mud, the hunger, the betrayal, but the songs erase all that dot the historical fact. Medieval literature painted knights as paragons of chivalry. From Arthurian romances to Chanson's digest, stories glorified gallant warriors, courtly love, and noble sacrifice. These tales traveled faster than truth, shaping how entire generations viewed knighthood. But you know firsthand those stories are about as accurate as calling crocodile dung sunscreen. Here's the quirky tidbit: sometimes poets were directly sponsored by knights or lords, meaning half the ballads were essentially medieval PR campaigns. Imagine paying a bard a sack of coins to write **so you bravely smote the enemy**, when in reality, You slipped in a ditch and barely crawled away with your shield dented. Fake news medieval edition. Historians still argue whether these myths were deliberate propaganda or simply idealized. Storytelling. Some say they were a cultural coping mechanism, painting over the brutality of constant wars with tales of honor. Others insist the audience knew they were fantasies but enjoyed them anyway. Like how we watch superhero movies today without expecting reality to match. For you, though, the disconnect stings. You know peasants cursed your name, you know battle stank of blood and fear, and you know your life was mostly debt and drudgery. Yet children grow up dreaming of becoming you, lured by ballads that erase your regrets. You wanted truth, but history wraps you in legend. And perhaps that's the final cruelty. You suffer the mud, while memory preserves only the shine. At the end of it all, you sit with the weight of years, surrounded not by cheering crowds but by silence. You trace the dents in your old armor, each one a memory of pain rather than glory, and you ask yourself the hardest question: was it worth it? The historical fact. Countless knights ended their lives not in triumph, but in obscurity, fallen in forgotten skirmishes, buried in modest graves, their names lost while lords and poets claimed the glory. For every knight immortalized in verse, hundreds more faded into dust, their regrets unrecorded. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some knights actually requested to be buried with their swords bent, or broken, a symbolic gesture that they're fighting. Days were truly over. Imagine handing your faithful blade to the grave digger, knowing it's more valuable as scrap than as a legacy. Historians still argue whether knighthood was truly an enviable station or simply a burden wrapped in ritual. Some see it as the pinnacle of medieval status, others view it as a gilded cage of debt, danger, and dependency. But you, with aching bones and fading sight, know the answer in your heart. Your life was never the shining dream sold in poems. It was sweat and sorrow, pain and politics, mud and mockery. You regret the choices, but more than that, you regret the illusion that you ever believed a knight's life was freedom, when it was really chains of iron and obligation. And now, as the hall grows quiet and the fire burns low, you accept that. Your story will not be told as it truly was. You will be remembered as a hero, while in truth you were a man trapped by a legend. And so, as the last echoes of your armored footsteps fade, let the regrets soften into the background hum of history. The clang of battle, the weight of steel, the endless duties, these all dissolve now into whispers. The knight's life was never easy, but in the telling, it becomes gentle, like distant thunder rolling away. Breathe slowly, and picture the torchlight of the castle halls dimming to embers. The banners overhead sway in a light breeze, no longer heavy with the cries of war, but fluttering like the hush of lullabies. The horses in the stables stamp once, then settle, their warmth rising like quiet breath against the cool night. You don't need to lift a sword anymore. You don't need to march in the mud or bow to lords, or worry about the crack of arrows in the air. All that sharpness blurs into the soft parchment of memory, pages gently closing on an old book. And if there is one truth left, it's that the legends survive because they soothe us. They sand away the pain, leaving only the gleam. You lived the rough edges, but now, for the listener, they shine like polished brass, and in that way, perhaps, there is peace. Your hardships transformed into stories that lull others to rest. So let go of the regrets. Let go of the weight of armor. Sink instead into the stillness, where even the echoes of your horse's hooves are muffled by the velvet of night. The story has ended, the torches burn low, and all that remains is rest. Sleep now, with the night's tale fading into a dream.